warm here. I hope it's not going to make you fall asleep. I'll be watching. My name is Joanna. I come from Poland. Last May, me and my husband visited America, and I was delighted to preach in quite a large Methodist church there. And I thought I preached my best sermon ever. So I was very happy to stand at the door and receive compliments. This is how humble I am. No, I'm just joking. Nobody said anything apart from this elderly gentleman who came to me, shook my hand very strongly and said, "I have been coming to this church for years, and for months I always switch off during the sermon, but because I couldn't understand your accent, I really had to listen." I hope that my accent will not stand in the way of you understanding the message that I want to share with you tonight. How many of you have heard the story of Hudson Taylor? Nobody. Wow. Okay, well, you're in the right place tonight to hear a little bit more. Hudson Taylor is a favorite missionary of mine. He has also become my mentor. He did die in 1905, but I do consider him my historical mentor, and I read the books about him, I read his journals, and I have learned so much from his life, and I hope that tonight you'll be inspired as well. I had a great privilege this year to visit Wales, and I kind of had a sense that in many churches in Wales that there's this pressure there for revival, to experience revival again, because Wales, especially in the area of Swansea and Cardiff and Locha, where the revival broke out, they received lots of foreigners, lots of people come and kind of think that the revival is still there, and it's not. And I think a lot of Christians in Wales feel quite frustrated because there is this pressure on them, because they are the land of revival, and the revival is nowhere to be seen anymore, unfortunately. And God reminded me when I visited Wales about a great illustration that one of the witnesses during the Welsh revival gave in order to illustrate how revival comes. And I do realize that we can't really work out the mysteries of God, and God comes by His grace, and we sometimes don't know how and why He does certain things in certain lands. We know that people pray and people fast and people long, and the Holy Spirit comes and He's welcomed, but sometimes we don't understand all the mysteries of God. But this one gentleman who experienced the great Welsh revival, and I know I'm supposed to talk about Hudson Taylor, but I just want to encourage you at the beginning to long for revival. This gentleman said that revival can be compared to a great reservoir of water. And every prayer that you pray, and every song that you sing, and every tear that you cry, and every longing that you bring to God is stored in this great reservoir. And one day, who knows, maybe tonight, you will pray this one last prayer that will tip over and spill over this amazing reservoir that is out there. And this is how revival happens. This is how he said, and I think it's really powerful. It's very encouraging that all your prayers and all your tears and all your songs at night are going to be turned into joy in the morning. And the story of Hudson Taylor for me is the story of collecting all the tears and all his prayers and all his experiences and all the conversations that he had had with people about Jesus into this great reservoir of God's grace. And as you know, probably great things are happening in China today. And I believe that these things are happening because of people like Hudson Taylor and thousands of others who went before this great revival in China today. And they have prepared the way. So if you are praying today and you're getting a little bit weary in your heart, I want to encourage you to keep on praying. Because no prayer, no matter how feeble, is not wasted in the kingdom of God. My personal story with Hudson Taylor began about 6 years ago when I was working for a Christian organization, and a gentleman called Rob Frost, who brought me to England. And one afternoon, I made a huge mistake by asking the office full of 16 British people who wants a cup of tea, because everybody wanted a cup of tea in the afternoon. And I thought to myself, I'm going to be stuck in the kitchen for a long time. I better take something to read. So I grabbed the first book that I saw on the bookshelf in the office, and I started reading it in the kitchen, and I couldn't stop. And I went back to my desk, and I continued to read, and I couldn't stop. And I went home, and I continued to read throughout the night. And it was a book about Hudson Taylor. And since then, I can say with all honesty that I believe that his testimony, his life, has saved my ministry. Because looking back, I realized that I was in the danger of losing heart in ministry, of becoming disillusioned and weary in my ministry. And reading about his life has really inspired me. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, to tell a life story in just 20 minutes. It's impossible. And I will have to concentrate on just few highlights from Hudson Taylor's life. But I want to tell you something before I start to tell you the story of Hudson Taylor, is that I believe that a lot of important things in Hudson Taylor's life, a lot of important battles that he has fought, were actually won at the back of a desert where nobody was watching. So I can tell you the important public things that he is known for, but when you read his story, actually the most moving moments are the moments where he's ill in bed, when he's grieving the death of his wife and many children that died in the mission field, when he's receiving letters of his missionaries being martyred. These are the battles that he has won victoriously at the back of a desert. And you all know the story of David and Goliath in the Bible. And I believe that David had the courage to face Goliath in the public because he was already fighting snakes and lions and cobras at the back of a desert where nobody was watching. And if you want confidence to live your life with integrity at the front of other people, then keep on fighting your battles when nobody is watching. God sees these battles and He will help you win them. Hudson Taylor was born in Barnsley in 1832. I'm not going to give you many dates because I know it's late and you probably won't remember, but he was born in 1832 in Barnsley in a Christian family, and both his parents were longing for a son because they had this dream, this desire to have a son who can go and be a missionary in China. So when Hudson Taylor was born, they were very excited. But very soon they also became very heartbroken because they realized that Hudson Taylor was a very poorly child. He was very ill. He was in fact so ill that they didn't know whether he's going to live for the first 5 years of his life. He couldn't attend school because of his health. So parents have never shared their dream with Hudson Taylor. They never told him that they wanted their son to go to a mission field in China. Hudson Taylor was a typical teenager, as you can imagine, in the 19th century. I don't know what naughty things teenagers did in the 19th century, but he was quite naughty. He was quite skeptical as well, and he fell into bad company. He was trying to make himself a Christian, but it wasn't working for him. It just wasn't working. But he had a praying mother. And again, if you are a mother here, if you are a father here, if you are a granddad or a grandma, and you are praying for somebody in your family or your friend, I want to encourage you to persevere. Because Hudson Taylor came to faith because of prayer of his faithful, persevering mother. And I will tell you a story how it happened, because it's very encouraging. One day Hudson Taylor was in the library of his father, and he was going through the books. And he thought, I'm not going to read all these heavy books on Christianity. So he found a little tract, just a little tract, Christian tract, but he even didn't want to read that. So he looked at the back, and there was a verse from the Bible written at the back, and he started to read this little verse. At the same time, his mother was visiting a friend 60 miles away from Barnsley, and she felt a real urge when she was sitting at the dinner table to go back to her room and pray. And she went to her room, closed the door, knelt down at her bed and prayed a wrestling prayer with God. She said, "Lord, save my son. And I'm not going to get up from here until I know in my heart, until I've got the assurance that he is saved." At the same time, exactly the same time, when she was praying this prayer, Hudson Taylor read this verse from the Bible, which said, "It is finished." Just one sentence. It is finished. The sentence that Jesus said on the cross. It is finished. And the Holy Spirit came, and the Holy Spirit interpreted this verse to his mind and to his heart. And Hudson Taylor, that moment, realized that all these years when he was trying to make himself a Christian, all these years of skepticism are all gone, and he accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior. Soon after came the call. Hudson Taylor was struggling with his flesh, he was struggling with his attitudes, even after he became a Christian, and he began to make deals with God. And he prayed this dangerous prayer, but sometimes some of us pray when we make a deal with God, "Lord, if you help me with that, then I'm going to do something else for you." So he prayed, "Lord, if you help me to deal with these ugly emotions in me, if you help me to fight the battles within my flesh, then I will go anywhere you want me to go, and I will do anything you want me to do." And later on, the same day, this is what he wrote in his journal. "Never shall I forget the feeling that came over me then. Words can never describe it. I felt I was in the presence of God, entering into covenant with the Almighty. I felt as though I wished to withdraw my promise, but I could not. Something seemed to say, 'Your prayer is answered. Your conditions are accepted.' And from that time, the conviction never left me that I was called to China." He began his preparation straight away. He gave up the luxuries of life, and at that time it was butter. He stopped eating butter, he began to eat bread and apples. He gave up his bed and started to sleep on the concrete floor, because he realized that if he cannot live by faith in the comforts of England, he will never be able to live by faith in discomforts of a missionary life. He began to learn Chinese. And at that time, let me remind you, in the 19th century, they didn't have these fancy devices that you put over your ears when you sleep, and they teach you Spanish while you sleep. They didn't have that. Hudson Taylor had the Gospel in John in Chinese and the Gospel of John in English, and it took him months to work out several characters that were repeated in the Gospels. And 4 years later, when he eventually got to China, he realized that he was learning the wrong version of Chinese, and he had to start all over again. You can imagine how frustrating it must have been. He started to write letters to missionary organizations because he wanted to be a missionary in China, but nobody wanted to accept him. At that time, in the 19th century, you had to be either wealthy, or you had to be educated or ordained. Educated preferably as a medical doctor, to be a missionary anywhere. So Hudson Taylor began his medical studies. But I need to take a little step back at the moment and tell you a little bit about the historical background, because without this historical background, you will not be able to fully understand his impact and his influence in China, and how far he had to go to really make inroads in the mission field. And I'm going to say us and our, because even though I'm from Poland, I do love you people, the British people, and I do identify with the British people so much. Our history, British history, is not great sometimes. There are great moments in the British history, there are moments that are not great. And one of those moments were the Opium Wars that broke out in China at the end of at the beginning of 19th century. I'm sure you have heard a little bit about the Opium Wars, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to explain to you what took place. British Empire was buying lots of goods from China, things like tea, things like silk, things like china, things like rhubarb, apparently. For those of you who don't like rhubarb, this is where rhubarb comes from. And we were paying in silver. And very soon we have realized that we are actually not making enough money in these transactions. So we started to think, what can we sell to the Chinese? And we started to bring opium from India to China. And within several years, it is said that 9 out of 10 men in the ports of China were addicted to opium. And this trade went on and on and on for years. The Chinese emperor, has written many moving letters to Queen Victoria at that time. They are so moving that I can't really read them to you because I just get really emotional. Very moving letters saying, why are you doing this to us? We have given you so many beautiful things, silk and tea and china. Why are you addicting our people to drugs? Unfortunately, these letters have never reached Queen Victoria, and one day the Chinese army overthrew the navy that was stationed in Canton, and all the boxes, hundreds of them, all the boxes of opium were thrown into the sea. The British Empire got very upset about the loss of their trade, and what followed was a series of unequal treaties. And they're called unequal because they were unequal. As a result of the first treaty, Hong Kong was ceded to British Empire for 150 years. As you know, Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. Not only that, the British Empire demanded that 4 more ports will be opened alongside the sea coast of China. So the drug trade has increased from 1 port in Canton to 5 more, by 4. There are more ports, and not only that, if you were British or French or American for that matter, you were above law in these treaty ports. So you can imagine how Chinese felt about foreigners. The foreigners were either feared or they were hated by the Chinese. And the foreigners were always afraid to leave the protection of these 5 ports, so nobody actually ventured out to inland China. Apart from this one gentleman called Karl Gutzlaff. Karl Gutzlaff was a missionary in China before Hudson Taylor. However, he was understandably a little bit afraid to venture too far away from the protection of the army in Shanghai. So he began to hire evangelists, Chinese native evangelists, and he was paying them money to go and evangelize in inland China. But soon, after he's done that, they have realized that these hired evangelists are sitting in the caves outside of Shanghai, smoking opium and making up reports about how great the mission is in inland China. So the funding in England kind of went down, and the people were no longer interested in mission in China. However, and this is just a little bit of a background as well, the Taiping Rebellion broke out. The farmers in inland China rebelled against the emperor, and they started to call themselves Christian Chinese. They were a mixed up bunch, really. The leader thought that he's the brother of Jesus, and they had all sorts of wrong theology going on. But at the beginning, for the first year or so, everybody in the West got really excited. They thought, oh, there's this rebellion going on in China, they're going to overthrow the emperor, but China is going to be open to the gospel. And indeed, suddenly, the door of China opened up again, and missionaries were allowed to come in. So money started to pour into the Christian organizations in China. They had millions of pounds, but they had nobody to send, apart from this one man. One man who was preparing himself for 4 years to be a missionary in China. One man who was training himself or being trained by God in the back of a desert. And this man is called Hudson Taylor. And they sent him on a 6-month journey on a ship to China, and he arrived in the middle of a war. He saw people, children and women being killed just at the front of his house. He didn't have a roof, so when winter came, one day he woke up and he could trace letters in his own duvet cover. He was so poor that even the poor said that he is poor. He lived among the poorest of people, and one day he writes in his journal, "People say that I am poor." Imagine how poor he must have been. But Hudson Taylor was determined, and he loved the Chinese with all his heart. And most of all, he loved the inland China, the people in rural farmland outside of the big cities on the East Coast. And this is where he wanted to be. He started to dress as a Chinese. He shaved his blonde, beautiful, Barnsley hair, and he grew a little ponytail, and he started to wear Chinese dress, and he spoke Chinese. He went through many months of loneliness until he met his wife. Maria Dyer was her name. She was an orphan who was born in Singapore to Christian missionaries. And they got married, and it's an amazing story. And Mark was telling us about John Wesley, and John's Wesley marriage unfortunately wasn't great. But Hudson Taylor and Maria were an amazing couple. There's even a book written about them, Hudson Taylor and Maria. And if you are looking for inspiration, if you are ministering together with your spouse, and you need this little bit of encouragement of how to work well together, then Hudson Taylor and Maria is a very unique story. Unfortunately, Maria did die when she was 33. She was very ill, so did their 3 children. They had 6 children together. 3 of them died in China during some of the journeys on the rivers. Very difficult story. Hudson Taylor did marry again an amazing marriage with Jenny. More children came. Again, unfortunately, some died, and they had twins that were stillborn. So you can imagine that the strain that these repeated bereavements had on his life. After 6 years in China, he went back to England to recover. A broken man in his body, especially because he wasn't healthy to start with, and he was lying in his bed, kept busy. He started to translate the New Testament into the Ningpo dialect. He was ministering in this town called Ningpo. But suddenly he started to look at the map of China that was on his wall, and he started to see from his bed that actually there is so much more than just Ningpo. So much more than just this little town in China that needs to hear about Jesus. And he started to strategize as he was looking at the map of his wall. And he began to pray. And he said, "Lord, I am not a leader. I'm not an administrator. I'm not a great mobilizer. But there is a need that I see out there on this map. I see all these thousands and thousands of villages. And behind these thousands and thousands of villages, there are millions and millions of people. Help me, give me a strategy to go back there and mobilize the team of missionaries." And he began to pray for missionaries to come. And Hudson Taylor was very greedy for God's blessing. And at first he asked for 4, and then he asked for 16, and then he asked for 24, and 70, and 100. And then at the end of life, he was able to lead a group of over 1,000 missionaries, always asking for more. But one day, when he was recovering in England, he went to a Christian conference in Brighton. I hear that Brighton still is a popular destination for holidays, apparently. I don't know why, because the beach is very stony. But anyway, he went to Brighton, and he went to this big church, and he saw Christians praising God, all very happy, lifting their hands up high. And he got very frustrated with what he saw. And he went for a walk on the beach in Brighton, and he prayed, "Lord, help me to mobilize these people, not only to fill their pews in the church, not only to be happy with their salvation, but to be called out from their comfort zones and come with me to China." And that very day, he paid in a check of £10 into a bank, and the bank account was opened under the name China Inland Mission. China Inland Mission was a great organization. China Inland Mission is great organization. It still functions under a different name. Some of you may have heard it, OMF, Overseas Mission Fellowship. They are one of the largest organizations that work in the Far East, and they keep very busy. They are called Overseas Mission Fellowship because their work has grown so big that they are now not only in China, they are in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Indonesia. Amazing, amazing work of God that they continue to do. Anyway, Hudson Taylor started to take missionaries with him back to China. But first of all, I want to show you, just very briefly, some of the requirements that he had for missionaries, because I find it, again, so inspiring. And maybe because personally, I have been in places where I know I have been trying to sell Christianity to people a little bit too much. I've been trying to sell projects in church a little bit too much by telling people all the perks and all the good things that come with us being involved in projects and missions. And you know, sometimes it's hard. It's hard in the mission time, in the mission field. It's hard to be out there and pour out your heart. There will be obstacles, there will be valleys to go through. And Hudson Taylor, when he was mobilizing people for mission, he's told people straight away that there will be difficulties, and if they are not prepared to face these difficulties, he said, don't come. If you're looking for comfort, do not come, because there may be very little comfort that you find. Listen to this. China is not to be won for Christ by self-seeking, ease-loving men and women, those not prepared for labor, self-denial, and many discouragements will be poor helpers in the work. In short, the men and women, Hudson Taylor was the first missionary who accepted single women on the mission field. The men and women we need are those who put Jesus, China, first and foremost in everything and at all times. If you want hard work and little appreciation, if you value God's approval more than you fear man's disapprobation, if you are prepared to take joyfully the spoiling of your goods and seal your testimony, if need be, with blood, if you can pity and love the poor Chinese in over mental and moral degradation, as well as ritual filth and impurity, you may count on a harvest of souls now and a crown of glory hereafter. The first group of missionaries went to China with Hudson Taylor. There were 16 of them. However, the trouble broke out on the journey there. And I'm going to kind of come to landing, so to say, with this story, because I fear that so often in ministries, in churches, we fall apart because of little things and little frustrations that are obstacles to the ministry. So the trouble broke out in Hudson Taylor's team over a pair of stockings. Every missionary on the boat received a package, and in this package was a Chinese dress that Hudson Taylor required everybody to wear, a Bible, a New Testament in Chinese, and 4 pairs of stockings for winter season. And one gentleman opened his package and he realized that one stocking from a pair is missing. And he took it very personally. And he got very upset, even though Hudson Taylor offered his own pair of stockings to him. He refused to have it, and from that moment onwards, he has given Hudson Taylor and China Inland Mission terrible trouble, made it very difficult. What is interesting is that Hudson Taylor never mentions this gentleman by name. He says, Mr., and then blanks out the name. We only know his name because of other missionaries who also complained about his behavior. But this gentleman has caused many, many troubles. And eventually, when they came to China and settled in one of the villages called Yangchao, this gentleman and others with him refused to wear a Chinese dress and caused a massive riot to break out in this village, because the Chinese didn't like foreigners. So when they saw foreigners, they started to spread the gossip around that 22 children were kidnapped and killed by these foreign missionaries, And a lot of people came and gathered around the house where the 16 missionaries were that Hudson Taylor brought, and many of them almost died during this riot. And the British Parliament in London heard about that and sent the army, and it was all quite bad. But this gentleman gave Hudson Taylor a very difficult time. Hudson Taylor had a massive heart for Chinese, and he is known to have said that he wants foreign missionaries to be like scaffolding around the building. And as soon as the work is done in China, he wants these foreign missionaries to be removed so that the Chinese can become leaders in their own nations. But because of people like that who got upset about a pair of stockings, there were some troubles, there were some valleys, even though the work grew in America and Australia and many people wanted to come and be a part of China Inland Mission, there was always opposition, there was always difficulty. And one lesson that I have learned from Hudson Taylor is that it is possible to live well, it is possible to live with integrity in the midst of difficulty. When all these troubles was going on, when the gentleman who got upset about the pair of stockings was complaining about Hudson Taylor, the funding in England went drastically low. People stopped giving to the ministry of Hudson Taylor. But there was one gentleman who always stood by Hudson Taylor, one gentleman who in fact is his greatest mentor. This gentleman has given to China Inland Mission over £2 million in today's money by faith alone. This gentleman has lost his wife at the same time as Hudson Taylor lost his wife. And in moments when the funding went down in England, this one gentleman always increased giving, and his name is George Miller of Bristol. And I don't know whether you know the story of George Miller of Bristol, but some of you are nodding heads, so I know he's well known. He's known for living by faith alone, for never asking for a penny himself. He's known for the fact that he has fed over 4,000 orphans by faith alone. And this gentleman, by faith, gave also to the ministry of Hudson Taylor. And when giving went down, he supernaturally knew that he needs to give a little bit more. And he sustained many missionaries in China, as well as orphans in Bristol, by faith alone. And I find it very, very moving, because we're not talking about Bill Gates here. We're talking about a simple man from Bristol who gave so much. And there's a beautiful story when he asked Hudson Taylor to give him a list of missionaries in need in China. And Hudson Taylor gave him names of 37 families that were stationed all over China. And George Miller looked at the list and he couldn't choose. So he chose all of them and just prayed a little bit more. And I find it a really moving story. Hudson Taylor traveled to China about 13 times in his life. He was truly Chinese in a sense, but sometimes he had to return to England or to America because of his health, or because the organization was growing so much they needed his leadership there. But he died in China in 1905. Before his death, however, when he was recovering in Switzerland, he started to receive letters from China informing him of deaths of many of his missionaries. I'm sure you have heard the phrase Boxer Rebellion. Boxer Rebellion broke out in China in 1900, and many hundreds of missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, were killed, children and women as well. Let me give to you a little bit of statistics, just a little paragraph of what Hudson Taylor and China Inland Mission was able to accomplish during before the Boxer outbreak. But I also want to say, as I always say in every church, we do live in the Western world. And I think that so often in the West, we want to know the outcomes. We want to know what are the measures, how can we measure the growth? Give us some statistics. We are very much into what are the outcomes of the work. But I want to tell you, as much as I'm very impressed with what Hudson Taylor has been able to accomplish with his team, what impresses me more is how he lived in the midst of difficulties, how he lived in the valleys of his life, how he lived during times of loneliness and grief and illness. This is what impresses me most, and this is something that inspires me. But let me read this to you, just to give you a little bit of a picture of how much the China Inland Mission has been able to accomplish. In January 1900, before the Boxer outbreak, there were, in connection with mission, 811 missionaries, including wives and associates, 171 stations, 223 outstations, 387 chapels. You can see how detailed he kept his diaries. 581 paid native helpers, 193 unpaid native helpers, 8,557 communicants in fellowship, 12,964 having been baptized from the commencement. There were 266 organized churches, 788 boarding scholars, 1,382 day scholars, 6 hospitals, because he was a doctor, 18 dispensaries, and 46 opium shelters. One lifetime. Lifetime full of difficulty. Lifetime full of bereavement and illness, and yet so much was done for God in China. At the end of Hudson Taylor's life, he wrote in his journal that the only way to go in life is to go forward on your knees. And that's why the title of his book, Going Forward on Your Knees. He also said that he has observed that there are 3 stages in any great work of God. First, it is impossible. Then, it is difficult. And then, it is done. If you are going through a difficult stage, it may seem the longest stage for you. But keep on going through this difficult stage, going forward on your knees. My brother Devon is going to sing what has become my favorite song of the whole tour, and it's called You Set Before Me an Open Door. And I have mentioned throughout my talk that the door in China often was closed to missionaries. Sometimes it would open just for a brief moment, and it would close again. But in the spiritual realm, God has set before Hudson Taylor an open door, and he went through it in obedience.